Hey folks, Reloading Bench here. I thought as I waited for more of my parts to come in for the 416 Barrett lower and moving forward with that project, I thought I would start dabbling in some of the other areas for me and reloading. And I was at the range this weekend talking to somebody I had not met, and we got to talking about reloading. And invariably, the question always comes up, what press to start with, and by that meaning something like a single stage, or going into progressive, jumping right into progressive. And you'll see this argument online. It's a Chevy versus Ford argument, in my opinion, in terms of going single stage, or possibly a turret, or even to progressive. So I'll give you my perspective because I gave it some thought, and when I look back on my history and what I've done, my focus would not yet be on the press, in all honesty. And so instead of saying what press do I get, I would change that to what book do I get, and I would even change that to what books do I get. So I like to read, and when I was just getting into reloading, at least physically, I'd been wanting to do a jump into reloading for a very, very long time. In fact, in the mid 80s, when I was in the military, when I was in the Army. So when I was in Arizona and shooting, and I thought, wow, let's get into reloading. But being in the military, living on base, and reloading aren't necessarily the greatest combination, especially when you have to keep your firearm in the armory. So that got put on hold for a very, very long time until I was much older. And when I did actually decide to take the plunge, I started looking around, and my focus was on books. And I wanted to get as much material as I could. And even with the books, when you look at who's out there and what's produced, again, kind of like cars, everybody's going to have their favorite, their preference, and their go-to. So I would say that I started out, again, I think you've heard it before, I'm a Lee fan. I think Richard Lee did some amazing things with reloading components, and he revised this. In fact, I'm hunting down on eBay the older version of both the Lee and the Hornady manuals. But when you look at the depth of information, as well as the history, and I think that's really what got me. And obviously, this is going to be a very Lee-centric history. But when you read about the history of some of these companies that we hear about today, CCI, Speer, RCBS, and what all these initials mean, and where they all started, and how they got their beginnings, and how I put them to use, it's pretty cool. So for the novice reloader, I think that information on what is reloading, these 100+ pages of what constitutes the history of, or constitute the history of reloading, regardless of who's presenting that, whether that's a Richard Lee presentation or a Hornady presentation, they're all going to have a different take on it, but at the end of the day, they're all going to talk about very comparable histories in the reloading space. And obviously Hornady will be very Hornady centric. But what I found interesting as I started comparing manuals was you're going to have manufacturers out there that produce all kinds of different equipment. Lee, for example, does a ton of equipment in the reloading space, as well as casting. But Lee doesn't make bullets. Lee doesn't sell bullets. Whereas Hornady, who creates a lot of stuff in the physical reloading space, also sells bullets. So a lot of their data is going to be very specific to Hornady type bullets and product numbers. So when you're sifting through a Hornady manual, if you're not shooting a Hornady bullet, That's not to say that this data is not valid. That's only to say that there's a focus on Hornady product, and then different powders. Hornady doesn't produce powder. Again, very different perspective, because some manufacturers produce things that others don't. Whereas somebody like Lee will have what I would call generic load data. So because Lee doesn't load, or excuse me, produce a bullet, they're going to have different types of bullet types and weights, and then the associated powders and loads for those particular weights. So to me, Lee was a little more generic in terms of exclusive, mutually exclusive from the bullet. So it didn't matter what the bullet was. Lee was going to have most likely a recipe for a particular type of bullet and weight. Hornady, generally a specific recipe for one of their bullets and a powder and a weight. To try and get a different perspective, I picked up Spear's manual a few years back. In fact, I don't even know what versions they're on. I think Hornady and Lee are pretty current. Lee's only revised it twice. It's on a second edition, multiple printings. And Hornady is on the 9th edition, probably due out for a new one in the next year or two. But when you look at what Spear had done, more along the lines of Hornady, their particular bullet, their particular perspective on reloading from a Spear point of view, but they also have the history of reloading as well, and again from a Spear perspective, as well as Lyman. I have a bunch of Lyman product, and I think they put out a great manual, especially for casting. So if you get into casting and want to understand, what you should be doing in terms of equipment, as well as the physical activity of casting, Lyman makes a great manual. So when I look at all of these together, I don't have one go-to. I would say I have my recipe, and the books on my workbench right now constitute that recipe. But that's not to say I don't also look at the internet. So when you think about what we're trying to do with this 416 Barrett project, none of that information is in any of these manuals. In fact, it's on Barrett's website, since it's their baby, and nobody else really has that information right now. Maybe in the next printing, maybe in the 10th edition of the Hornady handbook, you'll see that. So, and before anybody asks, the reason I picked up the two Lees, because they're both second editions, different size manual, different size print in order to read. Older I get, the harder it is to see, and generally the same information, but just in a slightly different presentation format in terms of layout on the page, but generally the same data. So I would say it's not necessarily about the press, and yes, I will do a video from my perspective on what that answer is to which press to start with. But again, it's going to be from my point of view. So take what I say with a grain of salt, because it's how I approached it, how I came up through learning to reload. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong way. There's your way, and there's reasons that you're going to go down the path that you're going to go down. But definitely, I can't say enough about the manuals, and it's just good reading, especially after you've been away from it for a few years, in terms of reading the background, to go back and reread some of this stuff, to see the history of why companies are the way they are today, in terms of who owns who, and where some of the splits were, and points of perspective from the founders. When you've got Hornady and Lee going at it in terms of what I would call cooperative competition. They're both trying to succeed in the 50s and 60s and post World War II, and why some of the reloading stuff evolved the way it did. So it's just interesting reading, and I think the focus should be on not yet the press, but more along the lines of what it makes sense to understand the history, not so much the history, but the components, and what you'll need to move forward in your reloading space. So my recommendation would be hold off on the press decision for now, focus on the books, You can find these new and used all over the place, and eBay's a great resource for stuff. The information doesn't change. There's not a huge change from edition to edition, so it's not like you have to keep purchasing the latest edition. But when I was getting into things, it was just around the time of these edition changes. So when they did Revit, I did pick it up, but not a big change from manual to manual. So you'll learn the basics, and for the recipes that may not be in any one of these particular guides, these books, very easy to find it online from the powder manufacturers or the bullet manufacturers. So the information's out there. I would focus on the books, and the decision for the press will come later. And we'll talk about that in another video.